Aid is not an enemy. Dependency is. Yes, dependency. What we must therefore decolonize is not the idea of aid, but the power that controls aid. And that's why the shift the power agenda matters. It reminds us that real change happens when communities move from the margins to the center, when ownership belongs to them, not to donors, not to consultants, not to policymakers, often sitting far away from the realities of things. But now, aid is not just about money. It's also about knowledge. Who decides what counts as evidence? Who decides what success looks like? Too often, it is the donors M&E frameworks, the donors log frame, the blah blah blah, and the external audits, and a lot of things that we call them. Meanwhile, our indigenous systems of accountability, storytelling, communal trust and networks, Ubuntu, solidarity economies are often sidelined, dismissed as informal or unscientific, even though there are a lot of literatures that have confirmed that they are more scientific than science itself. You see, if we're serious about decolonizing aid, we must also decolonize knowledge. Hello, my name is Muhammad, and let's talk about decolonizing aid for non-profits in Africa and the role of policymakers. You see, when I first started in the development space, I had an uncomfortable realization that some of the practices I was involved in were not liberating communities at all. They were rather quietly reinforcing the colonial patterns. So I found myself grappling with the realization that my actions, albeit unwittingly, mirrored those of a neo-colonial agent I had read about in the books. And the weight of this awareness often haunted my nights, forcing me to confront the unsettling truth that I had the role to play, to advocate for a shift in power towards a more inclusive, more localized, and more sustainable approaches to aid and partnership frameworks in Africa. Consequently, I became a lone advocate in various meetings, publications, and forums, persistently pushing for a power shift, even when it was uncomfortable. And so I began to ask myself, and that's what I'm asking you today, what if the problem is not aid itself, but the way power is organized around it? Because let's be honest, aid is not an enemy. Dependency is. Yes, dependency. What we must therefore decolonize is not the idea of aid, but the power that controls aid. And that's why the shift the power agenda matters. It reminds us that real change happens when communities move from the margins to the center, when ownership belongs to them, not to donors, not to consultants, not to policymakers, often sitting far away from the reality of things. But now, let's talk about the policymakers. You see, too often they are portrayed as helpless bystanders in the aid game. But the very truth is, they are the enablers, they are the negotiators, and oftentimes the barriers. They set the national and community priorities. They sit across the table from donors to negotiate the terms. They coordinate with the civil society. And ideally, they should ensure that the communities are not just consulted, but they are active participants in shaping what it delivers. Yet, the challenges are real. Weak engagement with civil society, alleged corruption, bureaucracy, and at times a lack of political will to decolonize at the speed, within the context, and at the form that non-profits and other key stakeholders are asking for. And one significant challenge impeding policymakers' engagement with non-profits is basically the lack of trust and weak engagement platforms. Across Africa, most funds to non-profit organizations flow directly to them, often bypassing the policymakers except at the broadest policy level. And within the complex nature of non-profits, even when reporting to authorities is mandated, we've had instances where CSOs often under-report for fear of government snooping and control. But this undermines the whole policy-making process needed to align aid with national priorities. I recall a conversation with a non-profit leader in Nigeria where he mentioned, and I quote, "Government asking us for a report of our activities is wrong. It is shrinking the civic space. From then, they will start asking for financial incentives or for jobs for their children and people." And I close. You see, these realities create instability, right? The lack of knowledge sharing, weak continuity in aid distribution, and an inability to develop a long-term strategies to tackle the most pressing development challenges. I further recall a conversation with a Senegalese official where he expressed his frustration And he said, and I quote, "When donors give CSOs money, they don't consult us until CSOs come knocking." You see, this is a stark disalignment. This is stark weakness in engagement. And how do you ensure? How can government ensure that they're able to do a good policy making when there is no sync with the civil society organizations? See, that frustration reveals a broken system and forces us to ask a very fundamental question we shine away from. Do our policymakers have the courage to defend sovereignty, negotiate boldly, and prioritize the people they serve? But aid is not just about money. It's also about knowledge. Who decides what counts as evidence? Who decides what success looks like? Too often, it is the donors M&E frameworks, the donors log frame, the blah, 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 and the external audits, and a lot of things that we call them. Meanwhile, our indigenous systems of accountability, storytelling, communal trust and networks, Ubuntu, solidarity economies, are often sidelined, dismissed as informal or unscientific, even though there are lots of literatures that have confirmed that they are more scientific than science itself. You see, if we're serious about decolonizing aid, we must also decolonize knowledge. Knowledge. Because development is not imported. It is lived, practiced, and innovated every day by communities themselves, by me and you who live with those realities. And if you want to know the truth about aid, let's not focus about the reports. Listen to the voices on the ground. I recall a conversation with an NGO leader in Nigeria who bluntly told me, our leaders just sign everything from the World Bank and China, and that's why we're suffering. So he alleged. In Senegal, another leader also told me that, and I quote, "They gave us maternal health funding, but then insisted on campaigning on issues that were not priorities of our communities." I close. And here he was talking about an instance where a donor gave them money for maternal health, but the donor was then asking that they campaign and advocate for conversation around LGBTQ. You see, these voices cut through the whole theory. They rather reveal the frustration of communities who at times feel like passengers in vehicles that they should be driving. And let's talk about the key recommendations. And you see, for donors, there is a need for them to fund with more trust. Fund with trust, not control. Be more flexible, less bureaucratic, and more responsive to local realities. Because at the very end, that's the only shortcut we have to achieving results. For policymakers, there is a need for us to negotiate smarter, not just rubber stamp agreements, and also ensure that we align aid with our sovereignty and our community priorities. Notwithstanding the need for diplomacy and understanding. For consultants and practitioners like myself, we need to stop enforcing donor scripts at all. We need to become facilitators of co-creation. It's either we avoid, we maneuver, or we just let it go. For CSOs, there is a need for us to diversify funding and go for other alternative funding mechanisms. Gladly, philanthropy is one of the very good things that's happening in Africa. And we need to ensure that we grant our legitimacy in communities, not just in grant agreements and conversations with donors. And let me put it sharply, as blunt as I can be. It should employ communities, not employers in New York, in London, or in Beijing. And so here's my message. Aid itself is not wrong. It has saved lives, it has built systems, and has supported change. What is wrong, therefore, is the power asymmetry around aid, the structures that silence communities and privilege external control. And the way forward is clear. We need to decolonize aid, we need to shift the power, and let African communities lead their own development futures. Because the real measure of success is not about how much aid flows into Africa, but how much power flows back to the people. How much can we do? And I also want to say this, while acknowledging all the collective efforts required to decolonize aid and forge a path towards a more genuine empowerment and self-determination for the continent and us, its people, there is a need for us to start here and for us to start now.